Welcome to the Parallel World Library, where we explore strange and fascinating stories in other dimensions. Now, let's relax your body and take your mind to another world. Number 13, Mink Street by TunaV. Chapter 15, Anomaly. 1. Reaching out to touch the switch, turning it on. A click, and the light came on. Sylvan continued stepping down into the basement. The feeling of fear often comes not from real things, but from imagination. The Inmare's basement was being decorated, and surely they wouldn't be foolish enough to create a gloomy and oppressive atmosphere. But at night, even if your walls are painted Barbie pink, as long as you know there are two corpses lying inside, you won't feel any warmth or cuteness. The crying continued. It came from Aunt Mary's workroom. Sylvan approached the workroom door. This door wasn't locked. There was no need to lock it. Sylvan paused, not hastily turning the doorknob but turning back to look behind him. Because of the light, the passage behind wasn't pitch black, but the spiral slope leading from the basement to the first floor was still a gloomy gray, making it impossible to see clearly what was behind. Closing his eyes and taking a deep breath, Sylvan hoped to smell something unusual. Unfortunately, he didn't have a dog's nose. Thinking of dogs, Sylvan turned his head to glance at the golden retriever he had led into the house earlier, but it hadn't followed him down to the basement. Truly a dog unworthy of affection. Reaching out, grasping the doorknob. The air suddenly changed momentarily, and a feeling of panic swept in. Not intense, but clearly perceptible. Immediately, the crying in the workroom stopped. Sylvan turned his head again. The light bulb overhead behind him still maintained its normal brightness. Click. Turning the handle, opening the door, reaching out again using the fastest speed to feel for the switch beside the door, immediately pressing it. Click! The room light blazed on. Clear light can bring immense psychological comfort. Two stretchers in the room distinctly held Jeff and Mo-san. Jeff's face was painted with gaudy makeup. You could see the thick layer of makeup, and his hair, also slightly styled with hair gel applied, looked quite lively. Presumably, Jeff had never been so spirited when alive. Mr. Mo-san looked much more normal, not heavily made up, but with more attention to details and naturalness, looking like he was in a deep sleep. While working, Aunt Mary had clearly been heavy on one side, light on the other. The difference between a welfare ticket and a regular order is displayed here. Of course, if Aunt Mary had known earlier that Mr. Mosen's children planned to cremate him, Mr. Mosen would probably have ended up just as gorgeous as the Jeff fellow next to him. Sylvan passed by Jeff's side. The earlier crying, carrying an aged feeling, clearly wasn't from a young person like Jeff. It could only be Mr. Mo-san. But standing in front of Mr. Mo-san, Sylvan only saw him lying there quietly, with no other anomalies. Reaching out, pulling over a round chair with wheels underneath, sitting down, feet propped on the railing under the stretcher. Sylvan tilted his head slightly, just staring at Mr. Mo-san like that. Meanwhile, the corner of his eye occasionally glanced at the open door, watching the passage, mainly at the end of the passage. Time flew by and a minute passed. During this moment, everything was calm. Are you a ghost or not? Show yourself or at least make a reaction. Sylvan sighed, preparing to leave. In the dead of night, a warm bed was still more appealing. Standing up as he passed by Mr. Mo-san, Sylvan noticed that a button on Mr. Mo-san's collar had come undone. He instinctively reached out to fasten it. But just as his fingertip touched Mr. Mosen's neck skin, Sylvan suddenly felt dizzy. This feeling was like being smoke drunk, his body swaying slightly with it. Sylvan immediately stabilized himself, his back against the wall.
Sob.
The choking sobs came again. Sylvan immediately raised his head. Right in front of him, Mr. Mosen still lay there, but at an angle, it was as if another figure appeared, curled up in the corner, crying. Seeing this scene, Sylvan didn't scream in fear. He had long prepared himself mentally. For Sylvan, seeing a ghost was much better than not seeing a ghost, and constantly feeling doubtful. Not seeing a ghost made him question whether his brain and mind were having problems. So, compared to I have a mental illness, Sylvan tended to accept that this is a neurotic world.
Mr. Mo-san?
Sylvan called out to the curled-up figure in the corner, but that figure seemed not to hear, made no response, and continued sobbing there. Sylvan stood up and began walking towards Mr. Mo-san. His eyes in reality seemed to have formed a kind of barrier. As he walked towards Mr. Mo-san, the distance between them didn't decrease, always maintaining a fixed distance. As Sylvan continued trying to get closer, Mr. Mo-san remained curled up in the distant corner. This eerie scene still hadn't frightened Sylvan. Rather, this supernatural constant distance made Sylvan's desire to explore rise.
So what I'm seeing isn't real.
After saying that, Sylvan bit his lower lip.
I'm talking nonsense again.
Then Sylvan tried moving horizontally. The curled-up figure of Mr. Mo-san also began to move accordingly. This feeling was like having a projector hanging on his forehead, projecting an image of a soul? Sylvan couldn't determine the material of this thing. After all, he had no way to reach out and touch it. But Sylvan suddenly had a thought. Following Sylvan's continuous change of direction, the sobbing Mr. Mo-san in the corner and Mr. Mo-san lying on the stretcher were placed in the same direction. After adjusting the direction, Sylvan moved his feet, bringing Mr. Mo-san's shadow and Mr. Mo-san's corpse together in one place. In fact, Sylvan himself didn't know why he was doing this. It seemed like an obvious thing to do, that a ghost soul should naturally return to its body. At least it was worth a try. When the two Mr. Mo-sans overlapped, Sylvan clearly saw the originally curled-up Mr. Mo-san suddenly stop crying. Then he stood up very confused, and under Sylvan's attentive gaze, Mr. Mo-san's shadow merged into Mr. Mo-san's corpse. The whole process was very quick, extremely smooth and fluid, and when the two sides completely merged, Sylvan only felt as if a hand gripped his mind tightly. Yes, his mind, not his forehead, nape, or scalp, but deep inside his brain. Directly squeezing, pulling out.
Ugh!
Sylvan let out a painful, cold grunt, his whole body kneeling to the ground. Fortunately, his hands instinctively supported him on the tiles. Otherwise, his face would have hit the hard floor. Even so, Sylvan saw drops of fresh blood falling onto the blue-white tiles in front of him. His nose was bleeding again. Chapter 16, Anomaly 2. One hand covering his nose, Sylvan began to stand up once again reluctantly. As he rose, Mr. Mo-san, lying on the stretcher with his makeup done, also slowly sat up. The movements of the two were almost synchronized, silently in sync.
Hey!
Sylvan called out. Although he knew clearly that all these suicidal behaviors were his own initiative rather than reflexes, when he saw a corpse sitting up right in front of him, he still couldn't avoid the shock from deep within his mind. Within the shock was a bit of panic, a bit of doubt, a bit of confusion, and absolute excitement. Mr. Mo-san gradually changed his posture from sitting on the stretcher to kneeling on it. When his eyes opened, they were colorless, a very monotonous grayish white.
Please, please, don't burn me. Don't burn me. Please don't. Cremate the body. Unforgivable. Cremating the body. Unforgivable.
Sylvan swallowed, watching Mr. Mo-san perform a religious kneeling and begging ritual towards him. He had heard from Aunt Mary that in Mr. Mo-san's religious beliefs, followers were not allowed to cremate their bodies. For a devout believer, two simple things best demonstrate one's piety: birth and death. Birth was joining the religion while alive, and death was following the religious teachings when ending one's life on this earth. The crying he had heard earlier was Mr. Mo-san's lament.
Mr. Mo-san? Mr. Mo-san?
Sylvan tried calling his name.
I beg you, don't burn me. Please, don't cremate me.
Mr. Mo-san kept repeating his plea. There was no way to have an equal conversation, only leaving behind a kind of instinct, or using a concept from his previous life to explain, It was an obsession. But how did all of this happen? And Aunt Mary, Uncle Mason, and the likes of Minna had never mentioned corpses producing anomalies. In other words, in the eyes of ordinary people, this world should still be normal. But first with Jeff and now with Mr. Mosan, Sylvan had consecutively encountered anomalies from corpses. He couldn't help but doubt. No, he was almost sure that all of this was triggered through some cause inseparable from himself. Was the cause in Sylvan or because of his reborn?
I beg you, don't burn me. Don't burn me. Please don't burn me. Don't burn me. Don't burn me.
Sylvan noticed that Mr. Mosan's speaking speed began to increase, his shoulders starting to tremble slightly, and his eyes, initially without any shine, now gradually filling with blood vessels. In the air, a dangerous atmosphere began to permeate.
Mr. Mosan?
Sylvan called out probingly again while his body began to move. Things were starting to get eerie, but the development seemed to follow a normal state that he could understand. For example, what will it do after a corpse is forcibly awakened? However, just as Sylvan had backed away from Mr. Mosan raised his head.
You want to cremate me?
Suddenly, Mr. Mosan's eyes were completely covered in blood, his body also violently thrashing. Muscles, bones, the balance of the entire body seemed to not exist, like a fish thrown on shore, flailing violently. Thud! Sylvan only felt his back take a heavy blow, his whole body falling forward. After losing, he immediately used both hands to support himself on the ground, turning his body. At this moment, Mr. Mosan followed, quickly reaching for Sylvan's neck. Sylvan raised his knee to thrust towards Mr. Mosan, but this body was somewhat weak, and his physical condition was not good to begin with. Secondly, Mr. Mosan's current weight could be even heavier than when he was alive. Sylvan's knee couldn't rise, and it was forced straight down under Mr. Mosan's pressure.
You dare to cremate me?
Mr. Mosan opened his mouth, biting down on Sylvan's chest. Chomp! Sylvan's chest felt like it had been hit with a stone hammer. Very painful. But the expected bloody mess didn't appear because Mr. Mosan's teeth mainly had fallen out when he was alive, eating only with dentures. So Mr. Mosan's gnawing couldn't cause any severe injury. But Mr. Mosan's hands, which had grabbed Sylvan's neck, began to exert force. His legs wrapped around, more like an octopus, entangling Sylvan tightly. Sylvan's hands exerted force, trying to escape, but his struggles now seemed somewhat futile. Almost in despair, pinned to the tiles, Sylvan could only turn his head to look towards the workroom door.
Dare to cremate me?
Mr. Mosan was like a madman. Pop! It sounded like metal clashing or like a light bulb exploding. Or was it like a finger snap? Sylvan could no longer clearly distinguish the tone, but his heart relaxed accordingly, silently crying out, "Saved." However, after that sound came,
burn me, burn me, burn me.
Mr. Mosan, who was already like a madman, fell into an even greater frenzy. Sylvan felt the force of the hands choking him was much stronger than before. This was the state where his neck was about to be broken. Like a sausage being grabbed at both ends and started to twist, waiting for one end to burst, Sylvan's eyes, ears, and nose now had the illusion of being about to explode.
You dare burn me! Dare! Burn!
Suddenly, Mr. Mosan seemed to have reached his limit, his body stiffening and then limping. After losing the grip on his neck, Sylvan began to pant heavily. The air in the basement couldn't be called fresh, but now Sylvan felt it was especially sweet. This wasn't an exaggerated technique, but because his throat was bleeding and also the nosebleed had seeped into his mouth, tasting sweet. Sylvan pushed Mr. Mosan off himself, his hands supporting the ground. He slowly moved his position until his back was against the wall, then stopped. He turned his head to glance outside the door. Nearby, a faint light was on. It was still dark in the distance. Sylvan used his hand to support his face. A moment later, he used his blood-stained hand to pat the back of his head a few times lightly.
Heh heh heh.
He laughed. After laughing, he took a deep breath, using English that didn't exist in this world to curse this world continuously.
What the fuck? What kind of goddamn world is this?
Dis stood on the path connecting the basement to the first floor. In front of him was the black cat lying prostrate on the first floor stairs. Dis turned his head looking towards Pal and asked,
The last words he spoke. What language was that?
The black cat raised its head to look at Dis. Then it emitted a woman's voice coming out of its mouth.
I've lived for 200 years, and I've never heard of any kind of demon that can create its own language.
Then Pal added,
Moreover, it's so complex and obscure.
This is the end of today's story. Please like and subscribe to support the channel and follow the next developments. Thank you.